Elijah Carter, a wealthy and powerful black CEO, becomes entangled in a series of controversial events when a routine business meeting at a small-town diner escalates into a blatant act of racial discrimination. Despite his respected status, Elijah faces suspicion and abuse of power from a local police officer and a manipulative real estate developer. Their biased actions and schemes expose deep-rooted corruption and systemic injustice within the community, igniting outrage and forcing Elijah to confront a system designed to undermine him. It was a quiet morning in Port Haven, a sleepy coastal town where the hum of fishing boats greeted the dawn, and locals gathered in small diners to swap stories over steaming mugs of coffee. In the corner booth of one such diner, the Lighthouse Cafe, a man sat alone, dressed simply in a navy sweater and dark jeans. If not for his striking presence, he might have blended seamlessly into the crowd. This was Elijah Carter, the CEO of Haventech Solutions, one of the fastest-growing renewable energy companies in the nation. At 42, Elijah was at the pinnacle of his career. His innovations were transforming industries, earning him a place on countless most influential lists. Yet, he was as unassuming as the town he quietly called home. Elijah didn't flaunt his wealth. He still drove his beat-up 2010 Ford pickup, a vehicle he'd bought back when Haventech was just an idea scribbled in notebooks. His sprawling estate was just a short drive away, but you'd rarely catch him there. Instead, Elijah preferred places like the Lighthouse Cafe, where he could order his usual coffee and eggs, sit by the window, and watch the world go by. The cafe was bustling that morning. The smell of bacon and pancakes filled the air as servers weaved between tables, balancing plates and coffee pots. The owner, a stout man named Bill, with a booming laugh, waved from behind the counter. "Morning, Eli, usual?" Elijah raised a hand in greeting, his warm smile disarming. "You know it. Bill extra crispy on the bacon." The regulars barely glanced his way. They knew him simply as Eli, a quiet man with kind eyes who tipped well and asked about their kids. Few in the town realized the scope of his influence beyond the borders of Port Haven. Elijah liked it that way. But there was a quiet tension in the air today, one Elijah couldn't ignore. At first, he thought it was the weather, the overcast sky giving the town an unusual gloom. Then he noticed the looks. Quick glances from unfamiliar faces, hushed whispers from a table near the door. Elijah adjusted in his seat, pulling out his tablet to review an email draft. He had a board meeting later in the week and was strategizing for the next big investment pitch. But even as he tried to focus, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Across the diner, a man in a crisp suit and polished shoes entered, his presence commanding attention. He carried a briefcase and walked with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. Elijah's eyes flicked up briefly, recognizing the type instantly: corporate, ambitious, and dismissive of small-town charm. The man glanced around, his brow furrowing as if unimpressed by the diner's worn leather booths and scuffed floors. Spotting Bill behind the counter, he marched over. "You the owner?" the man asked, his voice brisk. "That'd be me," Bill replied, wiping his hands on a towel. "What can I do for you?" "I'm Michael Crane, regional developer for Coastal Realty," the man announced, his voice dripping with self-importance. "We're expanding operations in this area and looking for partnerships. I've got an appointment with an Elijah Carter to discuss potential ventures." Bill's brows shot up in surprise, his gaze darting toward the corner booth. "Eli?" Michael followed Bill's gaze, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Elijah. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Michael laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. "That's Elijah Carter?" he said, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "You're kidding me." Elijah didn't react immediately. He closed his tablet, placed it neatly on the table, and stood, unfolding his tall frame with an easy grace. He walked over to the counter, extending a hand toward Michael. "Elijah Carter," he said, his tone calm, professional. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Crane." Michael hesitated, then shook his hand reluctantly, his expression still skeptical. "You're the CEO of Haventech?" "I am." Michael's eyes swept over Elijah, taking in the modest clothing, the lack of visible wealth or power markers. He seemed unable to reconcile the image of the man in front of him with the reputation he'd heard about. "Well," Michael said, clearing his throat, "I wasn't expecting this." Elijah smiled faintly. used to such reactions. Appearances can be deceiving. Michael chuckled, though it lacked warmth. Clearly, listen, Mr. Carter, I've got limited time, and I was hoping we could talk business in a more appropriate setting. I saw a coffee shop up the street that might. Elijah's already here, Michael, Bill interjected, his voice steady. And this is as fine a place as any to talk business. The diner fell quiet. Heads turned toward the counter, curiosity sparking in the regulars' eyes. Elijah could feel their gazes, but his own stayed locked on Michael, his expression unreadable. Of course, Elijah said after a beat, his voice unruffled. Let's sit down and discuss your proposal. For a moment, it looked as though Michael might protest, but something in Elijah's tone gave him pause. He nodded stiffly and followed Elijah back to the booth. The murmurs in the diner resumed, a low hum of speculation. As they sat, Elijah gestured for Michael to speak first. The developer launched into a polished pitch about expanding Coastal Realty's portfolio, emphasizing the company's commitment to modernizing underdeveloped areas, like Port Haven. His words were slick, rehearsed, and vaguely patronizing. Elijah listened patiently, his hands folded on the table. When Michael finally paused, Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice measured. Your plans sound ambitious, but I have concerns. Port Haven isn't just a location. It's a community. I'd need assurance that any development would benefit the people who live here, not displace them. Michael blinked, caught off guard. With all due respect, Mr. Carter, progress requires change. Some sacrifices are inevitable. Elijah's eyes darkened, though his voice remained calm. Sacrifices for whom, the developers or the residents? Michael opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a server approached with Elijah's breakfast. She placed the plate down with a warm smile. Here you go, Eli, extra crispy bacon, just how you like it. Thanks, Kim, Elijah said, his tone softening briefly. He picked up his fork and knife, cutting into his eggs, as if the conversation were merely a backdrop. Michael watched, clearly unsettled by Elijah's composure. The tension at the table grew, unnoticed by the other diners, but palpable to the two men sitting across from each other. As Elijah took a bite of his breakfast, Michael shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Carter, I appreciate your perspective, but I think you're underestimating the opportunity here. And I think you're underestimating the people of Port Haven, Elijah replied, his voice steady but firm. This town doesn't need outsiders dictating its future. If you want my support, you'll need to show me how your plans align with the community's values. Michael stared at him, the polished confidence in his demeanor faltering. For the first time since entering the diner, he seemed to grasp the depth of the man sitting across from him, not just a CEO, but a leader with integrity. The brewing conflict was far from resolved, but in that moment, it became clear that Elijah Carter wasn't a man easily dismissed, and as the tension hung thick in the air, the regulars in the Lighthouse Cafe carried on with their morning, oblivious to the storm quietly unfolding in their midst. Elijah sat back in the booth, his expression unreadable, though the subtle tightening of his jaw hinted at the simmering frustration beneath his composed exterior. Michael Crane's polished demeanor was cracking, his confidence faltering as he scribbled something on a notepad and adjusted his tie. The tension at their table was unmistakable. Around the cafe, conversations carried on, plates clattered, and coffee pots steamed, but the uneasy atmosphere between the two men created a quiet ripple that even the regulars could feel. Mr. Carter, Michael began, his voice a shade less confident than before. I'm sensing some hesitation on your part, I assure you. Coastal Realty has the resources and expertise to bring real progress to Port Haven. But I have to wonder if your resistance stems from a lack of understanding about how these projects typically unfold. There it was. The condescension. The subtle jab disguised as a polite observation, Elijah recognized it immediately, a tone he had encountered countless times in boardrooms, conferences, and dinners with investors. It was the same tone used by people who assumed they were smarter, more capable, and better suited to decision-making than he was. Elijah smiled faintly, his voice steady. I assure you, Mr. Crane, I understand quite well. I've spent years analyzing projects like yours and the impact they have on communities. Some succeed. Many do not. My concern isn't a lack of understanding. It's a refusal to overlook the cost of progress for the people who live here. Michael's pen froze mid-scribble, and for a moment, his expression hardened. With all due respect, Mr. Carter, this is a business discussion, not a moral debate. Elijah set down his fork and met Michael's gaze, his voice lowering slightly. For me, the two aren't separate. If that's a problem for you, then perhaps we should reconsider this conversation. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the bell above the cafe door jingled. A man and a woman in uniform walked in, their boots clunking on the worn tile floor. The Port Haven Sheriff's Department insignia gleamed on their jackets. Elijah didn't pay them much attention at first, but his awareness sharpened when their eyes lingered on his table longer than necessary. One of the officers, a tall man with a rigid posture, whispered something to his partner, a younger woman with sharp eyes and a tight ponytail. "Elijah Carter?" the male officer called out, his tone brusque. Elijah turned in his seat, his brow furrowing slightly. "That's me." The officer approached, his expression unreadable. "Mind stepping outside for a moment? We have a few questions." The diner fell silent. All eyes turned to Elijah. Their curiosity morphing into murmurs of speculation, Elijah stood slowly, his movements deliberate. His calm demeanor masked the knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't the first time he'd been in a situation like this, but it never got easier. Michael leaned back in the booth, looking amused. "I didn't realize the local law enforcement would take such an interest in our meeting," he quipped. Elijah ignored him, addressing the officers directly. "What's this about?" "Step outside," the male officer repeated, his voice firm. Elijah grabbed his coat and slid out of the booth. As he walked past the counter, Bill shot him a concerned look. "You need me to call anyone, Eli?" he asked under his breath. "I'll let you know," Elijah replied, his voice calm but resolute. Outside, the wind bit at Elijah's face as he faced the officers on the sidewalk. The younger officer stood a few steps behind her partner, her arms crossed, while the male officer pulled out a small notepad. "We received a report about suspicious activity in the area," he said, his tone clipped. "A man matching your description was seen loitering near several properties this morning." Elijah blinked, momentarily stunned by the absurdity of the statement. "Loitering? I was at home this morning, and came straight here. I don't know what you're talking about." The male officer raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "We'll need to verify that." "I see." Elijah folded his arms, keeping his voice measured. "Do you often stop people based on vague descriptions like this?" The officer stiffened. "We're doing our job, sir." "And I'm doing mine," Elijah replied evenly. "If you'd like to confirm my identity or whereabouts, I suggest contacting Bill inside. He's the cafe owner and can vouch for me." The younger officer stepped forward, her gaze scrutinizing Elijah as though she were searching for cracks in his composure. "Do you have any identification on you?" she asked. Elijah reached into his back pocket and handed her his driver's license. She examined it, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Elijah Carter," she read aloud, her tone laced with disbelief. "The CEO?" "That's correct," Elijah replied, watching her reaction carefully. The male officer glanced over her shoulder, frowning. "You expect us to believe that?" "Believe it or not, it's the truth," Elijah said, his patience wearing thin. "If you're done, I'd like to return to my meeting." The male officer hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We're just following up on a report. No need to get defensive." Elijah's voice cooled. "I'm not defensive. I'm aware of my rights, and I'm aware of what this looks like. You've stopped me because I fit someone's vague description, but you didn't approach anyone else in that diner, did you?" The officer's face darkened, but before he could respond, the door to the cafe opened. Bill stepped out, his hands shoved into his apron pockets. "Everything okay out here?" Bill asked, his tone casual but firm. "Mr. Carter is fine," the younger officer said quickly, handing back Elijah's license. Bill's eyes narrowed slightly. "Good to hear. He's been coming here for years, and I can vouch for him any time." The male officer muttered something under his breath and turned to Elijah. "You're free to go." "Free to go," Elijah echoed, his tone sharp. He slipped his license back into his pocket and stared at the officer for a moment longer before turning to Bill. "Thanks, Bill." "Any time," Bill said, his voice steady. Elijah walked back into the diner, his calm mask firmly in place. As he passed the counter, Kim gave him a look of sympathy. The regulars avoided his gaze, their unease palpable. When he returned to the booth, Michael was waiting with a smirk. "Trouble in paradise?" Elijah ignored the jab, sliding back into his seat. "Let's get back to your proposal." Michael chuckled, but there was a flicker of discomfort in his expression now. For all his bravado, it was clear he wasn't sure what to make of what had just happened. Elijah didn't care. He had no intention of letting Michael, or anyone else, derail the conversation any further. The meeting continued, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Every word exchanged between them felt like a battle, every glance a test of wills. Outside, the officers drove away, leaving behind the faint hum of injustice lingering in the air. Inside, Elijah sat tall, his voice calm but unwavering. He would not let the assumptions of others define him. Not here, not now, not ever. Elijah sat across from Michael, his composed demeanor a sharp contrast to the tension swirling in the room. The whispers from the other tables hadn't stopped, and though he wasn't looking, Elijah could feel the weight of curious, judgmental stares pressing against his back. Michael flipped through his sleek leather portfolio, clearly trying to regain control of the meeting. "Now, as I was saying before we were interrupted," he began, his smirk bordering on smug. "Coastal Realty's track record speaks for itself. We've successfully revitalized communities from the ground up. I think once you take a closer look, you'll find this project aligns perfectly with your company's values." Elijah leaned forward slightly, his tone calm, but pointed. "What I'm finding, Mr. Crane, is that you're using the word revitalize when you mean replace. Let's not sugarcoat what Coastal Realty does. It's gentrification. You're pushing out communities that don't fit your aesthetic in favor of profit-driven expansions, and you want me to back that no." Michael's smile faltered, his confidence shaken for the first time. "I think you're misunderstanding our intentions." "Am I?" Elijah cut in, his voice still low but carrying a steely edge. "Because what I see is a polished sales pitch that conveniently omits the displacement of families, small businesses, and the culture that makes places like Port Haven unique." Michael bristled, his hands tightening on the edge of the table. "This is how business works, Mr. Carter. Progress requires difficult decisions, and frankly, I'm surprised to hear someone in your position taking such an idealistic stance. Haventech didn't become a multi-million-dollar company without making compromises." Elijah's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the cafe door burst open. A middle-aged woman in a sharp pantsuit stormed in, her heels clicking angrily against the tile. Her auburn hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her expression was one of barely contained frustration. "Elijah!" she called out, striding directly to his booth. It was Lila Thompson, his chief legal officer, and one of his closest allies. "What's going on here?" Michael blinked in surprise, but Elijah simply smiled faintly. "Good morning, Lila. I didn't know you were back in town." "I wasn't, but then I got 3 phone calls about a meeting you were having that turned into this," she said, gesturing toward the diner. Her sharp eyes scanned Michael before landing back on Elijah. "And now I'm here to clean up whatever mess is brewing," Michael scoffed, leaning back in his seat. "This doesn't concern you, Ms. Thompson," she said crisply, her gaze locking on his. "And if it involves Mr. Carter, it concerns me." Michael raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by her assertiveness. "We're discussing a business proposal. I don't see how this requires legal intervention." Lila crossed her arms, her tone frosty. "Considering the implications of your project and how you've conducted yourself so far, I'd say legal intervention might be exactly what's needed." Elijah stood, his height making Michael seem smaller, as he looked down at him. "Lila, I appreciate you stepping in, but this isn't about cleaning up a mess, it's about standing firm. Coastal Realty doesn't align with our principles, and I won't be bullied into supporting their agenda." The tension in the diner thickened. Michael stood as well, his face flushed with anger. "Bullied? I think you're overstating things, Mr. Carter. This is just business." "No," Elijah said, his voice steady. "This is my community, and if you think you can steamroll over it because you see dollar signs, you're mistaken." Michael opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the shrill sound of sirens pierced the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the cafe's windows, and moments later, 2 squad cars screeched to a halt outside. The diner grew eerily quiet as the officers from earlier stepped out of their vehicles. This time, they weren't alone. A third officer emerged, taller and broader than the others, his uniform adorned with a higher rank. He strode into the diner with an air of authority that made even the regulars fall silent. "Mr. Carter," the officer said, his tone laced with tension, "I need you to come with us." Elijah's brow furrowed. On what grounds? The officer hesitated, glancing briefly at his colleagues. "We've received additional reports tying you to suspicious activities in the area. It would be best if you cooperated." Lila stepped forward, her voice cutting through the charged atmosphere. "Absolutely not. This is blatant harassment, and you know it. If you have evidence, present it. Otherwise, my client isn't going anywhere." The officer's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking to Michael, who was now smirking openly. Elijah caught the exchange, his stomach twisting. This wasn't just about vague reports or mistaken identities. Someone had escalated this, and he had a strong suspicion of who. "I'll cooperate," Elijah said, his tone calm but resolute. "But understand this. You're making a mistake." "Eli," Lila started, but he held up a hand, silencing her. "It's fine," he said softly. "Let's not make a scene." The officers moved forward, and one pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The clink of metal echoed in the diner, making Elijah's chest tighten. He felt every gaze on him as his wrists were restrained, the cold steel biting against his skin. For a man who had built his life on integrity and hard work, the indignity of this moment stung deeply. As they led him outside, Elijah glanced over his shoulder at Lila. Her expression was a mix of anger and determination, and he knew she wouldn't let this go. Whatever was happening, she would get to the bottom of it. The crowd outside had grown, drawn by the flashing lights and commotion. Elijah kept his head high, refusing to let the whispers and stares diminish his dignity. But inside, his resolve hardened. This wasn't just an attack on him, it was a challenge to everything he stood for. As he was placed in the back of the squad car, Elijah's mind raced. He wasn't just going to defend himself, he was going to expose whatever corruption or bias had led to this moment, because if there was one thing he had learned in his years at Haventech, it was that true power didn't come from wealth or titles. It came from standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. And he wasn't done fighting. The ride to the police station was suffocating, not because of the confined space of the squad car, but because of what the moment represented. Elijah Carter, a man who had spoken at international summits and met with heads of state, was now sitting in the back of a patrol car, his wrists bound in cold steel. He stared out the window, the familiar streets of Port Haven passing by in a surreal blur. His mind raced, not with fear, but with a sharp focus. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was targeted. He thought of Michael Crane's smirk in the diner, the quick exchange of glances between the officer and the developer. It was too coincidental. And yet, even with this clarity, the injustice of it all simmered in his chest. When they arrived at the station, Elijah stepped out of the car with his head high. He refused to give the onlookers, passers-by and officers alike, the satisfaction of seeing him diminished. His presence, even in this moment, was commanding. Inside, the station was cold and impersonal. The officer who had cuffed him led him through the main area, past desks where other officers barely glanced up. It was routine for them, but for Elijah, it was anything but. Each step felt heavy, the weight of systemic biases pressing against him with every move. "Sit here," the officer barked, pointing to a metal bench near the holding cells. Elijah sat without a word, his calm exterior betraying none of the fire burning inside him. As the officer disappeared into an office, he glanced around, taking in the scene. A young black man was sitting in a cell nearby, his head in his hands. An older woman, clearly distraught, was arguing with an officer at the front desk. The image of the young man struck a chord in Elijah. How many others had been through this, pulled into a system that was rigged against them from the start? How many had their futures stolen because no one stood up to fight back? "Elijah!" The sharp voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Lila Thompson striding into the station, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor with authority. Behind her was Mitchell Harper, Haventech's COO, and a longtime friend of Elijah's, Mitchell, usually mild-mannered and soft-spoken, looked furious. Lila approached the desk, her voice slicing through the low murmur of the station. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge now." The desk officer, a burly man with a tired expression, raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Lila Thompson, Chief Legal Officer of Haven Tech Solutions. You're holding my client without cause, and I'm here to rectify that." The officer leaned back in his chair, unbothered. "You'll need to wait, Sergeant Daniels is busy." Lila's eyes narrowed. "Then unbusy him, because if Mr. Carter isn't released immediately, you'll be facing more legal action than this department has ever seen." Mitchell stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This is unacceptable. Elijah has done nothing wrong, and you know it." The desk officer sighed and picked up the phone, muttering something before hanging up. A moment later, a door opened, and a tall man with a commanding presence entered. Sergeant Daniels had an air of authority that he clearly enjoyed wielding. "What's the issue here?" Daniels asked, his tone clipped. Lila didn't hesitate. "The issue is that you've detained a man without evidence or cause. I want to know on what grounds Mr. Carter was arrested." Daniels glanced at Elijah, his expression unreadable. "We received multiple reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mr. Carter matched the description provided." "And what was that description?" Lila pressed. Daniels hesitated, then said, "A tall black man seen loitering near private properties." Lila's laughter was sharp and humorless. "That's it? That's your justification? You've detained one of the most prominent figures in this community because he happened to exist in public while being black?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "We followed procedure." "No," Elijah said, his voice cutting through the tension. "What you followed were assumptions. Assumptions rooted in bias. Let's not pretend this is about procedure. This is about power, and who you think deserves to have it." Daniel's eyes flashed, but before he could respond, the station door swung open again. A group of people entered, community leaders, local activists, and even a few reporters who had clearly caught wind of the situation. At the center of the group was Bill, the cafe owner, and Kim, one of the servers. "Elijah's done more for this town than anyone else," Bill's voice boomed, silencing the murmurs. "And you're treating him like a criminal because of some vague, baseless report. We're not standing for it." The room buzzed with energy as others chimed in, their voices growing louder. Reporters snapped photos, their flashes lighting up the station. Daniel's composure wavered as the scene spiraled out of his control. "Elijah Carter deserves better than this," one of the activists shouted. "This whole community does." Elijah stood, his voice calm but commanding. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person in this town who's been treated unfairly because of how they look. This system isn't broken. It's working exactly as it was designed. And that's the real problem." The crowd quieted, hanging on his every word. Elijah turned to Daniels, his gaze steady. "You can keep playing by the same rules, or you can be part of the change. But know this. I won't stop fighting until there's accountability." Daniels looked around, his authority slipping as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Lila stepped closer to Elijah, her voice low. "We're not leaving without you." A tense silence filled the room. Then, Daniels sighed heavily. "Release him." The word sparked a wave of relief through the crowd. Lila immediately moved to Elijah's side. As an officer unlocked his cuffs, Mitchell clapped him on the shoulder, his expression a mix of pride and frustration. As Elijah rubbed his wrists, he turned to the crowd. "This isn't over. It's time to take a stand, not just today, but every day." The cheers that erupted were deafening, but Elijah's focus was already shifting. He wasn't thinking about his release or the vindication of the moment. He was strategizing, planning his next move. Because this wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about dismantling the system that had allowed this to happen. Elijah stood at the podium in the packed town hall, his voice steady and resonant. As he addressed the crowd, he had called this meeting after reviewing the damning evidence. Emails between Michael Crane and Sergeant Daniels that revealed a calculated attempt to intimidate and silence him. The town hall was filled with Port Haven's residents, reporters, and community leaders. It was more than a meeting. It was a reckoning. "I have lived in this town for years," Elijah said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I've built a company here, hired locals, and fought for this community's growth, not at its expense, but alongside it. And yet, I've been treated like a threat. Not because of my actions, but because of assumptions, biases, and an abuse of power. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lila stood to the side, arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Mitchell was next to her, nodding in support. At the back of the hall, Bill and Kim exchanged worried glances. They knew this confrontation wasn't just about Elijah, it was about every injustice Port Haven had silently endured. Elijah lifted a folder from the table and held it up. "These emails," he said, his voice rising slightly, "prove what many of us already know: systemic corruption is alive and well in Port Haven. This wasn't just an attack on me, this was an attack on fairness, on accountability, and on the values we claim to stand for." The tension in the room was palpable. In the front row, Michael Crane shifted uncomfortably, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of the scrutiny. Next to him, Sergeant Daniels sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, refusing to meet Elijah's eyes. Elijah placed the folder back on the table and stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "Sergeant Daniels," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "would you care to explain why a public servant was colluding with a private developer to intimidate a member of this community?" All eyes turned to Daniels. He hesitated, then stood, his broad shoulders squared. "This is an exaggeration," he said, his tone defensive. "Those emails don't prove anything. It's standard protocol to investigate suspicious activity, and Mr. Carter fit the description we received." "That's a lie," Elijah said, his voice steady but unyielding. "The emails show clear coordination between you and Mr. Crane. You weren't investigating suspicious activity, you were orchestrating it." The crowd gasped, and Daniels's face reddened. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he snapped. "I've served this community for decades." "And in that time," Elijah shot back, "how many others have you targeted? How many times have you abused your authority to protect personal or political interests?" Daniels took a step forward, his anger boiling over. "You think you're better than the rest of us because you're rich, because you run a company. You don't know what it's like to keep this town in order." Elijah didn't flinch. He met Daniels' glare with unwavering resolve. "What I know," he said, his voice cutting like steel, "is that leadership isn't about control, it's about service, and you've failed this community." The room erupted into heated murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and community members whispered to one another. Daniels looked around, realizing he was losing control of the narrative. Michael Crane stood suddenly, raising his hands to quiet the room. "Let's not lose sight of what's important," he said, his voice dripping with faux concern. "This isn't about emails or personal vendettas, it's about progress for Port Haven. Mr. Carter is letting personal grievances derail opportunities for this community." Elijah turned to face him, his calm exterior masking the storm within. "Opportunities for whom, Mr. Crane? For the residents who'd be displaced, for the small businesses you'd bulldoze, or for Coastal Realty, who stands to make millions while this town loses its identity?" Michael's smile faltered. "You're twisting the facts." "No," Elijah said, stepping closer to the edge of the stage. "I'm exposing them." He turned back to the crowd, his voice rising with conviction. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's been silenced, dismissed, or devalued because someone else thought they could take what didn't belong to them. This is about holding people like Sergeant Daniels and Michael Crane accountable, not just for their actions, but for the harm they've caused." The crowd erupted into applause, the energy in the room reaching a fever pitch. Elijah stood tall, his presence commanding, as Daniels and Crane exchanged nervous glances. The tide was turning, and they knew it, but Elijah wasn't finished. "I'm calling for an independent investigation into the Port Haven Police Department," he said, his voice steady, despite the thunderous applause. "We need transparency, we need accountability, and we need to ensure that no one, not even those in power, is above the law." Lila stepped forward, her expression fierce. "And we're filing a civil lawsuit against Coastal Realty for their role in this scheme. This isn't just a fight for Elijah, it's a fight for justice." The room erupted again, and Elijah felt a surge of determination. He had stood his ground, exposed the corruption, and ignited a movement. But as he looked out over the crowd, he knew the fight was far from over. The following evening, Elijah Carter stood in the grand chamber of Port Haven's community courthouse. The room buzzed with tension as residents, reporters, and local officials packed every seat. The town council had convened an emergency hearing to address the damning evidence that Elijah had presented, emails implicating Sergeant Daniels and Michael Crane in a calculated scheme to intimidate and manipulate him into supporting Coastal Realty's development plans. The air was thick with anticipation as the meeting began. Mayor Harriet Devereaux, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a voice that commanded respect, called the room to order. She adjusted her glasses and fixed a stern gaze on the parties involved. "Elijah Carter," she said, her tone measured but firm. "You've raised serious allegations against Sergeant Daniels and Michael Crane. This council takes these matters seriously. We will hear your case now." Elijah rose from his seat, his tall frame emanating calm authority. He glanced at Lila, seated beside him, and she gave him a small nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward to address the council. "Thank you, Mayor Devereaux," Elijah began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "This isn't just about me, it's about systemic issues that have plagued our town for far too long. The emails I've submitted to this council reveal a deliberate effort by Sergeant Daniels and Mr. Crane to use intimidation and false accusations as tools of leverage." He placed a copy of the emails on the table, letting the weight of the evidence settle over the room. "These emails," Elijah continued, "show explicit communication between Sergeant Daniels and Mr. Crane, plotting to target me because of my refusal to back their project. They intended to use law enforcement as a weapon, not to serve or protect, but to silence and coerce." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Daniels and Crane, seated at the opposite end of the chamber. Daniels' face was flushed with anger, while Crane wore a veneer of smugness, though his jaw tightened as Elijah spoke. Mayor Devereaux gestured toward Daniels. "Sergeant Daniels, you are entitled to respond." Daniels stood, his body tense. "This is a baseless attack," he said, his voice rising. "Mr. Carter is twisting the facts to suit his narrative. I've served this town with integrity for over 2 decades. These allegations are an insult to my record." Elijah didn't flinch. "Your record doesn't absolve you of accountability, Sergeant. Your actions speak louder than your years of service." Daniels glared at Elijah, his anger boiling over. "You think you're untouchable because you're rich, because you've got people like her?" He pointed toward Lila. "To fight your battles, you're no better than anyone else in this room." Elijah's voice remained calm, but there was steel in his tone. "You're right about one thing, Sergeant. I'm no better than anyone else, and that's exactly why I'm standing here demanding accountability, because no one, especially those in positions of power, should be above the law." The crowd murmured in agreement, their support for Elijah palpable. Daniel's composure cracked further, his face a mask of frustration. Then Crane stood, raising his hands to quiet the room. "Let's not lose sight of what matters," he said, his voice smooth but insincere. "This isn't about personal grievances, it's about the future of Port Haven. Mr. Carter has turned this into a spectacle to distract from the opportunities our project can bring." Elijah turned to face him, his eyes locked on Crane's. "The only spectacle here is the lengths you've gone to in order to undermine this community. You don't care about Port Haven, you care about profit, at any cost." Crane's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "This is business, Mr. Carter. Not everyone has the luxury of idealism." "Business without ethics," Elijah replied, "is exploitation, and this town deserves better than that." The tension in the room was electric. The council members leaned forward, hanging on every word. Mayor Devereaux raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "Mr. Carter," she said, "do you have additional evidence to support your claims?" Elijah nodded. "Yes, Mayor. In addition to the emails, I've provided statements from other residents who've experienced similar abuses of power under Sergeant Daniels's watch. This isn't an isolated incident, it's a pattern." Lila stepped forward, distributing copies of the statements to the council. "These accounts paint a clear picture of systemic bias and corruption," she said. "This isn't just about one officer or one developer, it's about holding those in power accountable for their actions." Daniel's face turned pale as the council reviewed the documents. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Mayor Devereaux leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Sergeant Daniels, Mr. Crane, Do you have anything to say in your defense? Crane opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the doors to the chamber burst open. A young officer rushed in, carrying a file. He whispered urgently to the mayor, who scanned the contents with growing concern. After a tense pause, she addressed the room. This council has just received additional evidence from an internal investigation. It appears there are financial records linking Mr. Crane's company to undisclosed payments made to Sergeant Daniels. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, while residents shouted in outrage. Daniels slumped in his seat, the weight of the revelation crushing him. Crane's face turned ashen, his confidence crumbling. Elijah stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. This is what happens when power goes unchecked, but today, we're taking the first step toward change. Mayor Devereaux banged her gavel, restoring order. This council will convene an emergency session to determine the appropriate actions. Until then, Sergeant Daniels is suspended, and Mr. Crane's proposal is indefinitely tabled. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the chamber. Elijah turned to Lila, who gave him a rare smile of pride. Mitchell clapped him on the back, his relief evident. As the meeting adjourned, Elijah stood in the center of the room, surrounded by supporters and well-wishers, but his focus was already on the road ahead. This victory was just the beginning. The fallout from the council meeting was swift and decisive. By the following morning, news of Sergeant Daniels' suspension and Michael Crane's financial improprieties had spread beyond Port Haven, capturing regional headlines. Reporters flocked to the small town, eager to uncover every detail of the scandal. Elijah sat in his office at Haventech, watching the live coverage on a muted screen. His phone buzzed continuously, with messages of support from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had heard his story. Though the weight of the previous days still lingered, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Lila entered the office, a stack of folders under her arm. "We've got confirmation," she said, placing the papers on his desk. The payments Crane made to Daniels weren't just for intimidation tactics, they were part of a broader scheme to suppress opposition to his developments in multiple towns. This isn't just a local issue, it's a regional operation. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing. "How many people have been affected?" "Too many," Lila replied, her voice heavy. "But this is the leverage we need. With this evidence, we can not only ensure Crane and Daniels face justice, but we can also push for systemic reforms." Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening. "This isn't just about them anymore, we need to address the system that allowed this to happen." That evening, Elijah attended a rally in the heart of Port Haven. The square was packed with residents, many holding signs that read, "Justice for all and end corruption." Now the energy was electric, a mix of anger, hope, and determination. Elijah stepped onto the makeshift stage, greeted by thunderous applause. He scanned the crowd, spotting familiar faces: Bill, Kim, Mitchell, and even the young man who had been in the holding cell at the police station. They had all come together, united by a shared desire for change. Taking the microphone, Elijah began to speak. "This week, we've seen the worst and the best of our community. We've seen corruption, abuse of power, and attempts to silence voices that demand accountability. But we've also seen courage, resilience, and a community that refuses to back down." The crowd erupted into cheers, their support washing over him like a wave. "This isn't the end," Elijah continued. "It's the beginning of something bigger. We're not just fighting for justice in this town, we're setting an example for others. We're proving that when we stand together, we can challenge even the most entrenched systems." As he spoke, Elijah felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was a movement. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Daniels and Crane expanded. Daniels resigned from the police force under pressure, his reputation irreparably tarnished. Crane faced multiple charges, including bribery and conspiracy, and Coastal Realty's projects were halted pending a full audit. Elijah and Lila worked tirelessly, partnering with local organizations to advocate for police reform and stricter oversight of development projects. Their efforts culminated in the formation of a community oversight board, giving residents a direct voice in local governance. The young man Elijah had seen in the holding cell, Marcus, became one of the first members of the board. Inspired by Elijah's courage, He shared his own story of unjust treatment at the hands of the system, galvanizing others to speak out. For Elijah, the work was far from over, but each step forward felt like a victory. Late one night, Elijah returned to his quiet home on the outskirts of town. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the windows. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat on the porch, staring out at the stillness of the night. The events of the past weeks played in his mind: the confrontation with Daniels, the rallying of the community, the small but significant steps toward change. He thought about the moments when he had doubted himself, the anger he had suppressed, and the strength he had drawn from those around him. Lila's words echoed in his mind. "This is bigger than you." He knew she was right. The fight for justice wasn't about one man or one incident. It was about challenging a system and building a future where everyone was treated with dignity and fairness. Elijah sipped his tea, a faint smile crossing his lips. He wasn't naive. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Across Port Haven, the impact of Elijah's actions was undeniable. Local businesses, schools, and churches began hosting workshops on racial bias and systemic inequality. The police department underwent a thorough review, resulting in new leadership and mandatory training programs. But perhaps the most significant change was the sense of empowerment that swept through the community. People who had once felt voiceless now spoke out. Neighbors who had lived in quiet frustration now found common ground and solidarity. Elijah's story became a catalyst, inspiring other towns to examine their own practices and demand accountability. What started as a small-town struggle was quickly becoming a regional movement. One morning, as Elijah prepared for another day of meetings and advocacy, his phone buzzed with a call from a national organization dedicated to criminal justice reform. They had heard about his work in Port Haven and wanted him to join their board. Elijah hesitated for a moment, his thoughts drifting back to the diner where it all began. He had never sought the spotlight, but now he realized the importance of using his platform to amplify the voices of others. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice steady. As he ended the call, Elijah felt a sense of purpose that went beyond his role as CEO. He wasn't just leading a company, he was leading a movement. Sitting in his home office one evening, Elijah reviewed the events of the past few months. The weight of what had transpired was still heavy, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, it was a reminder, a call to keep moving forward. He thought back to that day in the diner, a moment that began as a simple breakfast and spiraled into something far greater. What if he had stayed silent? What if he had walked away from Michael Crane's arrogance, or let Sergeant Daniels' abuse of power go unchallenged? The questions gnawed at him, but the answer was clear. If he hadn't stood up, nothing would have changed. That realization had fueled his determination throughout the ordeal. Elijah had faced public scrutiny, moments of doubt, and the frustration of fighting a system designed to protect those in power. Yet, he never allowed it to break him. Instead, he used each challenge as a stepping stone, building a stronger resolve with every step. Elijah leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the darkened sky. He wasn't the same man he'd been before. He had always valued humility and integrity. But now those values carried a sharper edge. They were no longer just personal principles. They were tools for change. The changes in Port Haven extended beyond the walls of the courthouse or the offices of local officials. The rallying cries of the community had spread, inspiring neighboring towns to examine their own practices. People who had once felt voiceless began sharing their stories, calling out injustices, and demanding accountability. One of Elijah's proudest moments came when he attended the first meeting of the Community Oversight Board. Marcus, the young man he had seen in the holding cell, stood at the front of the room, addressing the board with confidence. His voice, once shaky with fear, now carried the strength of someone who knew they were being heard. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," Marcus said, his words resonating deeply with everyone present. "It's about building something better, something that works for everyone." Elijah had smiled, feeling a surge of pride. Marcus was proof that the fight wasn't just about tearing down systems of oppression. It was about lifting people up. The events in Port Haven underscored the importance of collective action. Elijah's journey began with a personal struggle, but it was the strength of the community that turned it into a movement. Bill and Kim, who had spoken out at the diner, Lila, who had fought tirelessly in the legal trenches, Mitchell, who had stood by his side every step of the way, and the countless residents who had rallied together, refusing to let injustice go unchallenged. Each of them played a role in shifting the tide. Elijah realized that while individual courage was essential, lasting change required unity. It wasn't about one person's voice, it was about many voices coming together to demand better. He also learned the value of persistence. The fight for justice was messy, exhausting, and often thankless, but every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory, and those victories, when added together, could change the world. The story of Port Haven was a microcosm of a larger issue: systemic inequality that pervaded institutions across the country. Elijah's experience highlighted the insidious nature of these systems, how they thrived on assumptions, biases, and unchecked power. But it also showed that they weren't invincible. Elijah's story became a symbol of hope, inspiring others to take action in their own communities. Local leaders began implementing reforms, while national organizations reached out to Elijah for guidance. His story was featured in media outlets, not as a tale of victimhood, but as an example of resilience and the power of standing up. "Justice isn't a destination," Elijah had said in one interview. "It's a journey, and it's one we all have to walk together." As Elijah prepared for another town hall meeting, he reflected on the road ahead. There was still so much work to be done: policies to change, communities to uplift, and systems to rebuild. But he was ready. He knew the journey wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, resistance, and moments of doubt. But Elijah also knew he wasn't alone. He had seen the strength of his community, the fire in their eyes, and the determination in their hearts together. They had proven that change was possible. And Elijah was committed to that change, not just for Port Haven, but for every place where voices were silenced and justice felt out of reach. At the town hall, Elijah stood before a packed room, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "We've come a long way," he said. "But this is only the beginning. Real change takes time, effort, and the willingness to keep fighting, even when it feels like the odds are against us. But if we've learned anything from this journey, it's that we are stronger together." He paused, letting his words sink in. This fight isn't just about holding people accountable, it's about creating a future where everyone, no matter their background or circumstances, is treated with dignity and respect, and that's a fight worth continuing. The applause was thunderous, but Elijah's focus wasn't on the noise, it was on the faces of the people in front of him, the hope in their eyes, the determination in their expressions. He saw a community that had found its voice, and he knew that voice would only grow louder. As the crowd dispersed, Elijah lingered in the empty hall, taking a moment to himself. The journey that had started in a small diner had brought him here, to the heart of a movement. It wasn't the path he had expected, but it was one he was proud to walk. He thought about the challenges ahead and the victories still to come. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it would happen, because Port Haven had shown that even in the face of injustice, people could rise, unite, and fight for what was right. And Elijah Carter would be there, every step of the way.